Welcome to Systems Philosophy. In the episodes up until now, I've focused a lot on drilling in the basics of how the fundamental concepts apply across various fields. Dynamic equilibrium systems, drift in those systems, networking of the systems at the same level, those systems becoming modularized to prevent them from being brittle in the overall change and evolution, and then the systems reflexively feeding into all of the network aspects and the systems nesting. I've also placed emphasis on being flexible and understanding paradigms, certain perspectives and points of view. Today, I'm going to take us to a next level in terms of how the biological search algorithm unlocked learning and cultural transmission. The nervous system evolved early because animals needed the ability to control their bodies, quick time, transmit both sensory information and signals for muscles at speeds faster than chemical gradients would allow. Those early nervous systems were mainly dedicated analog control circuits. They were capable of learning and fine-tuning behaviour, but the scope was limited. The number of actual neurons was limited, and most of all, the performance was variable because until endotherms, animals that regulated their own body temperature, evolved. Neurons had to be capable of being cooled and heated with the environment. An exotherm, an animal that relies on the external temperature, might bask in the sun like a lizard, warm itself up to an operating temperature, and then have muscles that become every bit as capable as a mammal's. The way that the neuron functions, it means that the computation is highly variable. I'm just watching the water, making sure I don't need to get up here. So it wasn't until bodies regulated their own temperature with the age of birds, mammals, and perhaps some warm-blooded dinosaurs that the internal environment of the body was stable enough for the nervous system to evolve complex learning brains. With those learning brains, an individual could learn quite complex behaviour in a lifetime. Recent research into the octopus, with its distributed brain architecture, where every arm has its own brain and then a central brain that coordinates the arm, and it's sort of a mesh network computing architecture, shows that intelligence doesn't require transmitted learning. The juvenile octopus floats off with the plankton and grows up independently and all the intelligence it gathers is learned within a lifetime. It shows that brains, even of invertebrates, can be highly functional and complex. And many science fiction writers have imagined intelligent, sort of octopus, squid-like creatures. We don't have clear cultural transmission within the exothermic species that I am aware of. I could be wrong, but I haven't heard of it. With endothermy and land animals in particular, the eggs became larger, so mothers invested more of their biology into each individual. Instead of producing thousands or millions of eggs, and the octopus produces in the thousands, I believe, from what I've seen. I haven't counted them, but they look like a lot. It's like fish roe. What mammals and even some higher reptiles, and I've talked about turtles and crocodiles before, they produce clutches of perhaps hundreds. Birds produce clutches that don't regularly exceed maybe 10 or 20, and sometimes far fewer. As the investment of the female in the size of the egg grows, what we get is we get more mature offspring that need to be guarded. We need a maternal instinct to develop as part of evolutionary research. Now, that can, in some cases, become a paternal instinct, and evolution, in the case of the male ostrich, has shown us that there are always exceptions to the rule. The main thing is that the eggs remain guarded. A primitive form of gardening is done by the sea turtle, which lays the eggs in a nest and then leaves. But the choice of nest is designed to at least give the young a chance, but the sea turtle still lays eggs in the range of 100 or more. When you get down to fewer offspring, then because those offspring are most vulnerable when they are first hatched, born, then the evolutionary pressure gets into having those offspring emerge more mature to the point where buffalo give birth to offspring that can run within hours of birth. In addition to physical maturity, they also have a brain capable of learning. So unlike the octopus, which has intelligence that can learn, what a lot of mothers, including bird species, do is that they raise their chicks in the nest, providing food, a sheltered nesting site, and even behavioural protection. There's many behavioural, I would say largely instinctive routines that mother birds and even father birds, males and females, will do to protect the offspring, luring predators away. There's one case where a ground nesting bird will feign an injury so that a predator like a fox will think it has an easy meal, and then just before it's caught, it will fly away, hopefully having distracted the fox from the nest. the line between nature and nurture, between what is learnt and what is inherited in terms of behaviour, starts to get blurry. And biologists have taught us that they've taught us that bird songs, for instance, can become localized, and so it shows that the song is not carried in the genetics. The bird calls are, at least to some degree, cultural. They're transmitted from parents to offspring, and the most direct form of transmission is from mother to child, because during that period of intense nurturing, even solitary species can learn from the mother. Cultural transmission becomes more robust in species both with larger brains capable of carrying more of that culture and learning, and also with social species, species that cohabitate, that don't just raise their young in groups, that also exist as a clan. Even simple species, meerkats, can have quite complicated cultural behaviour that sits on top of the normal instinctive repertoire. More evolved, and in this case I'm talking about the branch of the tree that has followed the potential of culture. We have this bias looking back at evolution from our perspective because we see ourselves at the cultural extreme and therefore speak ourselves as highly evolved and look back at all other species as less evolved. From the perspective of survival and adaptation, I think a good case can be made. The human species, through culture and technology, has become the apex predator in every habitat on the planet. So there is a strong case to be made. That's not to say that evolution has any purpose or direction other than success. And given at the number of humans and the way that we currently have reflexively modified the ecology and geography of the earth through our built technological infrastructure, again, I think there's a strong case to be made in our favour as being highly evolved in terms of fitness and capability. But before we get to humans, I find it very useful to acknowledge that culture evolved at least many tens of millions of years before humans and language. And cultural transmission is an important medium, and I will get into humans and language in another episode. What I want to highlight today is that the evolution of brains to control bodies has eventually led to animals with brains evolved enough and offspring mature enough to bootstrap cultural transmission from parent to offspring That provided a reflexive feedback loop in terms of success, and culture proved to be quite successful, especially in group environments. From a systems philosophy perspective, what the search algorithm discovered was a separate information carrier. Up until now, the information carrier has been in the physical form and the form of genetics, of genes. With culture, we have arguably created software for the brain that can be transmitted from animal to animal, from parent to offspring, from one group member to another, and that predates language. We have highly developed culture in some of the closer relatives. Well, maybe that isn't even true, but let's say mammals. Whales, especially orca, but the whales in general appear to have very sophisticated culture, arguably even their own language, yet they lack the hands that allow them to utilize physical resources and then have the technological boost that we humans got. Exactly how far their language took them, who knows? Elephants have extensive culture where the matriarchs remember waterholes and geography in climates where water is vital for survival, and the herds that are migratory will be driven by the knowledge of the matriarchs and their decision-making process to decide whether to chase better food, better safety, or scarce water. That is a multi-year learning process that the herd as a unit carries. And the matriarch gains leadership not through the strength of an alpha male, but through the wisdom of having experienced and learnt the patterns that will let the herd survive, and so they follow her decisions. Orca pods and even whale pods can develop language dialects, and so do birds. The bird calls themselves become specific to an ecosystem or a valley. Wolves and wolf packs have highly coordinated hunting strategies, and a wolf pack can become quite large, and their success depends on communication and coordination. And the wolf pack itself carries the techniques that are learned, the culture. So the software discovered by the evolutionary search algorithm has become reflexively coupled to certain configurations. Mammals, which are warm-blooded and therefore have a stable neurological environment, so they can specialize their brain functions without having to worry about those functions being disrupted by temperature fluctuations, were one part of the unlock. Mature offspring at lower numbers that rarely exceed 10 or a dozen is another part of the unlock, because now evolution favours the survival of those young into maturity, because the female has invested heavily of herself into producing the biomass in the offspring and therefore can't reproduce the sheer numbers to beat the odds. Therefore, we need intelligence to beat the odds. Some of that intelligence is by skipping the most vulnerable stage of the juvenile, as in the tortoise, the sea turtle, burying the eggs, protecting the eggs, as in the case of crocodiles and alligators, but not necessarily teaching the young. But we can see the early phases of that behaviour related to the investment of fewer but more mature offspring. Then we have the flip to warm-bloodedness, the ability to remain active at night when exotherms in climates that cool overnight become vulnerable, or at least less active. So mammals, even in the times of dinosaurs, can have burrows in which they rest through the day, and in the cool of the night their insulated fur and internal heating allows them an advantage, at least in terms of getting away from the predators, because the predators, like a morning insect or a morning lizard, are sluggish. And then finally, we get the culture where the increased investment in a parent of guarding the nest starts to transmit information in a form that is new, that is from brain to brain. We have biologically invented the equivalent of software that can be copied from one hardware form to another without going through the path of DNA and biological reproduction in the cell. I think that's a good point to leave it for today. I've opened up a huge new space for discussion, which will form the centre of the next episodes. And we are now starting to approach the things that make us human. I've spent perhaps what some might see as an overly long time reaching this point, because a lot of the most interesting philosophy happens in the human sphere. After all, it's what we care about. But I have a reason. The reason is most evident in my framing that culture predates language, it predates mammals, and it is at least tens, if not hundreds of millions of years old. It is, in terms of evolution, a relatively recent innovation. However, it is extremely powerful, because once you unlock software transmission as a separate information field to the DNA and structural relationship of species in ecology, then the search algorithm has discovered a branch that has evolved with tremendous success and come to dominate the kingdoms of life. I'll hold it there for today. This has been a sunrise by the Southern Ocean and another episode of Systems Philosophy. Thank you for your attention and time.